Hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So today we're going to continue to work with analysis, but we're going to get a bit more specific. So we've learned the basics of analysis, the key terms and concepts, the basic procedure that we're going to be using. So this week we're going to get a little bit more focused on a particular type of analysis. We are going to be looking at process analysis, which is just one of many different kinds of analytical writing that you'll find in academic settings and also the workplace. But process analysis is an especially practical, useful type of writing. It can help us in a lot of different situations, both in school and, like I said, certain work situations as well. So generally, we're pretty familiar with process analysis. That's another reason we like to teach it. But basically, this is just a technique that's used to explain the steps or the sequence involved in completing an action, some kind of complex action or process. So obviously, if the action or process is incredibly simple and very quick, we don't really need to break it down into individual steps, individual parts, and elements. So we are talking about relatively complex actions, complex processes that involve multiple steps, multiple things, perhaps done over a period of time. So most of us are familiar with this genre of writing. We encounter it all the time, and throughout our lives we learn a lot of different processes that will prove to be very important in our lives. So when we're very young, we learn the process for tying our shoes, for crossing the street, later driving a car, writing an English paper. These are all processes. We've talked about the writing process quite a bit in this class. That's quite literally a step-by-step process for writing a paper. So we are all familiar with this type of writing, even if we've never really felt like we were doing it in school. We've come across it in on many different occasions. If you've ever assembled furniture, if you've ever followed directions or instructions, you are utilizing a process analysis. You're sort of the reader in that scenario. You are receiving the process analysis. If you've ever, done simple things like program a remote control, or, you can learn a lot of different processes on YouTube. You can learn how to do a lot of things. So we've all experienced this kind of writing, but again, we've probably been, for the most part, on the receiving end. We're probably used to being the reader, consuming somebody else's process analysis. So in its simplest form, this type of writing can often appear simply as directions or instructions, step-by-step directions like you might see when you're assembling furniture. But process analysis can also get a lot more complicated than that. And we're not stuck with just that step-by-step format. We can do some other things within this genre. But basically, all we're trying to do here is we're taking a process. That is our subject of analysis. Remember that term from last week. We are choosing a process that we think is important or interesting, and we're going to eventually be breaking it down. We're going to eventually find a framework of analysis, find a way to really zero in on and focus on what it is that we want to show our readers. We're trying to explain this process. We're trying to explain how it works. So we create a framework, and then we look at individual parts and elements, just like we were talking about last week. But now our individual parts and elements are going to be individual steps or individual actions, things that people need to do in order to complete this larger process. So our terms don't change, and our procedure will not change. It will remain the same as what we saw last week, but now instead of, books or songs or a bicycle or a car or, some of the things that we were looking at last week, now we're going to focus on processes. Processes will become our subjects of analysis. So you can still utilize, aspects of cooking or a knowledge of cars, but now we're not just going to be analyzing things, we're going to be analyzing larger processes. So that's a little bit more involved, but it's something that we're already pretty familiar with. So we have a good base, we have a good starting point, and we're just going to learn a little bit more this week so that next week we can get started on Essay 2, which will, of course, be a process analysis. So typically we have sort of two general types of process analysis, and I define both of these types in the Week 7 overview. On one hand, we have what are often called sort of directional or directive process analyses. And these are pretty much what they sound like. They are directions, typically step-by-step directions or instructions that are designed to sort of walk a person through all of the steps, all of the actions involved in a particular process. This is what we're most familiar with. Like I was saying, we've all seen this type of process analysis. Sometimes there can be quite a bit of detail and information attached to each step, to each part. In other cases, it's pretty simple and bare bones, but that's the basic idea. The goal of a directional process analysis is to allow readers to follow the instructions and achieve a goal by the end, to complete that action or process by the end. The other type is often called informational or explanatory. And these are used generally to explain complex processes, not necessarily so that the reader can then go and do that process, but rather so the reader can simply understand the process and understand how it works. So in those cases, we're not necessarily following step-by-step instructions. We are going to see things broken down into steps or into individual parts and elements, but the goal isn't necessarily for us to do all of those things. And in some cases, it might actually be impossible for us to do all of those things, but the goal is for us to understand the process intellectually and to be able to sort of recreate it in our own minds. So if you look in the Week 7 module, you'll notice an example of each type. So we have a very simple sort of step-by-step process analysis. It's all about the coffee beans, how to harvest and make your own coffee. We get steps. We get step-by-step instructions. They give us detail. They give us a lot of info, but the goal is for us to follow their steps and achieve, completion of that process. So pretty straightforward. The other one that I posted, the one from Schoolhouse Rock, I Am Just a Bill, that's a little bit different. Again, we get steps. We get individual parts, but in that case, the process analysis is not really designed for each individual person watching to follow all of those steps. As you can tell, one individual, one citizen wouldn't be able to pass a bill all by ourselves. But as the process makes clear, we can be involved at the beginning stages of the bill passing process. We can contact our local legislator, our local congressperson, and sort of bring something to their attention, and then they can write the bill and they can ultimately get it through the different legislative chambers. So that's a process that we're just trying to understand. We're not necessarily going to go out and do it ourselves exactly in the way that it's presented there in the video. So just be aware of those two different types. We're actually going to be sort of combining those types next week when we start working on our own process analyses. Because as you guys can imagine, I don't want you to stick with the really bare bones directional style. You can use a directional process analysis, but we need a lot of info, we need a lot of detail, we need a lot of description. So we're going to import certain aspects of the more explanatory style where we get more text. We get more detail. We're going to be using some of that, even if our goal is to provide directions or instructions that readers can actually follow. So we'll be combining the two approaches to give ourselves plenty to do in Essay 2. So I've broken down what we're going to be doing this week and next with process analysis. I've broken it down into some steps that seems appropriate for this type of writing. So we sort of have a 4-step process that I want us to get comfortable with this week, and then we can use it next week as we begin writing. So part 1, obviously you need to come up with a thesis or a larger point. That can sometimes be difficult with writing like this. Obviously, you need to select your subject of analysis. I'm sort of assuming that you will have already done that by the time you start on my list. Once you know the process that you want to analyze, you have to figure out what it is that you want to say about it. How are you going to explain it? How are you going to put together your explanation, your analysis? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to communicate to your readers? With this type of writing, like I said, some students kind of forget to have a thesis. Some students think that they don't really need one because they're just providing step-by-step instructions. But remember, we are doing more than that. So it's fine to provide instructions, but you also need to be very clear about what the ultimate goal is. Like what is the reader trying to accomplish? If the reader completes this process, if they complete all of the actions that you're outlining for them, what is that going to look like? What is that end result going to be for the reader? And sometimes it's pretty self-explanatory. You're just kind of explaining what the product will look like, what it will feel like, and what it will enable the reader to do. And sometimes that just takes a couple of sentences, but you need to be clear. Don't make a lot of assumptions about what your audience already knows or doesn't know. So you got to be really clear about what you're trying to communicate to your audience. What do you want us to know about your subject of analysis? And again, your subject of analysis is simply the process that you choose to write about. So you need to be thinking about the thesis from the very beginning, because that's going to dictate a lot of your future decisions. Like number 2, what do you need to include? I mean, this is when you start thinking about individual parts and elements. This is when you start deciding what steps you need to include, what information do you need to provide. Again, what do your readers need in order to understand this larger process? What do your readers need to know? So this is sort of like selecting those key narrative events for your narrative when you were trying to figure out your plot. You have to figure out what are the most important things here. What are the most important actions, the most important steps, the most important pieces of information. So this is where you're starting to break things down, but you also need to have a framework. So you don't have to necessarily go in my order. Number 3 is my framework or my structure. We talked about this last week, the principle of analysis. What is your focus? How are you going to organize your analysis? So again, this is going to be based on your thesis. This is going to be based on the end result, the larger outcome that you're trying to sort of arrive at. And you also have to figure out what the structure is going to look like. How is your framework, how is your structure going to be arranged? And this will depend on the process that you choose. Some processes already have sort of a predetermined or an already accepted sequence. And this is true of a lot of things that we do all the time, like certain cleaning tasks or recipes for different food dishes, or a lot of things that, might involve working on machines, cars, whatever. There might be an accepted process already sort of in place. You're not necessarily reinventing the wheel. I want you to put sort of your own spin on it, but you might largely be sort of recreating things that you've already learned, things that you've done, knowledge that has sort of been passed down. So there might already be a sequence that's largely accepted and used, so you can kind of stick with that sequence. You can stick with that structure that already exists, and then you can figure out exactly what all you're going to mention or include, all the different parts. How many steps do you need? How many different elements or parts can you break this thing down into? So in some cases, a lot of the decisions will already be made for you about sequence and maybe which individual parts or steps are most important. But for other processes, you might have to sort of create a sequence or a structure all your own. There might not be one already in existence, or there might be multiple different ways of completing this particular process, and you need to choose your way, or the way that you think is best, the way that you want to present this information to your readers. So this is where you really start to figure out your body paragraphs. What are you going to include in each body? So this, if you have a good plan here, it will help you when you outline. You can start planning each individual paragraph once you have a sense of your structure. What are you going to include, and what order is everything going to be arranged in? That's really important for a process analysis, because organization is key. If your reader cannot follow the organizational structure, they're not going to be able to complete the action. They're not going to be able to accomplish the larger goals. So these are the same kinds of things that we were talking about last week, but we might not have to go in exactly the same order that we were talking about last week. So you might break things down into individual parts before you create your structure or framework, or you might have that structure or framework already in place by the time you start looking at individual parts and elements. But don't forget about the importance of individual parts and elements. Again, these might be steps. These might be, in some cases, like actual objects or items that we have to manipulate or do things with. These can be physical actions. These can take on a lot of forms. In some cases, they might be thoughts. They might be things we have to say, things we have to do. They might involve movement. They might involve assembly. They might just involve us creating things, ourselves, whatever. Just, you have to be specific, and you have to be clear about all the parts, all the steps, everything that you need to include. So along the way, I put this at number 4, but really you can be thinking about this throughout, and you might want to be thinking about this early as you're kind of figuring out your larger plan and what you're trying to accomplish, what you want your readers to be able to accomplish after reading your analysis. Think about background info. Think about anything that you need to provide your audience. Again, depending on how complicated or involved your process is. So in some cases, there might be some specialized equipment required. If your readers need specific gear, specific materials, you need to be clear about that. You might want to sketch some of that out beforehand when you're pre-writing, so you can make sure to incorporate some of that stuff in your actual draft. And even if your process isn't particularly complicated, you need to pay attention to language. You need to pay attention to some of the things that we were talking about when we were doing narrative. Don't forget about descriptive language. Don't forget that you really are trying to use imagery and paint some pictures in your readers' minds. Also, remember some of those directional or transitional words that we were talking about with descriptive writing. Words that help to orient the reader, help to make the reader understand kind of where they are in time or space. Words like first, next, later, beside, next to, above, below. Just simple words that give us cues about spatial relationships and about the passage of time. as you can imagine, these are very important things to include in a process analysis because you need to make it clear what this sequence is. And again, we're obviously using chronological sequence here. It's not like our narrative when we could play around with our sequence of time. We want to stay chronological here. So you need to clearly indicate to the readers, okay, we're doing this first, and then next we're doing this. After that, we're doing this other thing. But also spatial relationships are important, especially if we're building something, if we're assembling any kind of equipment or machinery. We need to know where things are in relation to each other. So simple words like those can help just to provide clarity for the reader. But like I said, any kind of specialized terms, any kind of specialized equipment, in some cases, what I mean by specialized terms would be like jargon, vocabulary, language that's very specific to a particular field or a particular, area of study or discipline. So stuff that's unique to, fishing or hunting or auto mechanics, a lot of different fields, computer science, a lot of different fields have their own sort of unique jargons, words that might not make sense outside the context of that particular area or job field. So if you have jargon, you need to explain it. If there's any specialized equipment required, you need to talk about that, explain that. If there's anything else that might be unfamiliar to a general audience, again, you can't assume that your audience knows a whole lot about your subject of analysis, your process. So if there's anything that's a little bit outside of common knowledge, you might need to provide definitions, explanations, or examples. And that's stuff that you can plan as well. And then finally, just make sure you're writing good introductory and concluding paragraphs. Some students, again, they want to arrange this kind of assignment into step-by-step instructions like I might find if I go and buy some furniture at Target. That's not what we're doing. That's not the kind of writing that we're doing. We're still following our traditional academic essay sort of format. So we're still going to have an intro paragraph. We're still going to have body paragraphs, and then we're still going to have a concluding paragraph. So obviously the bodies, that's where you're going to do most of your explanation of the process. That's where most of the analysis occurs. As you break it down into all those steps, that's where most of the info gets delivered. But don't neglect the intro and the conclusion. They're important too, just like they always are in an academic essay. So the essay, the intro of the essay needs to introduce your process. And a lot of your processes aren't going to be, unusual or hard to understand, but just be clear about exactly what it is you're analyzing. And you're also going to provide your thesis in the intro paragraph. This is also a good place to provide a little bit of background info, not a ton, but if you just have a little bit that you want to provide, just a little bit of detail right after you introduce the process, that would be great. But then you want to wrap up the intro paragraph with your thesis, which is your purpose, your overall conclusion. Remember what we were talking about last week, the ultimate goal with analysis, we break something down, we understand how it works, and then we explain it to our audience. So you have to figure out what it is that you're explaining. And in some cases, it's very simple. I'm explaining how to make this particular dish. Cooking is often a process. I'm explaining how to clean a bathroom. Processes like that are simple, but you still need to announce the goal. Tell your readers what they are striving for. What's the end result? What does it look like? What does it smell like, taste like, whatever. Even if it seems pretty obvious, you still need to have a clear thesis no matter what your process is. And if you pick a process that just seems so easy and so obvious that it's not even interesting to write about, don't use that process. Find a different one. So everybody will have a thesis that needs to come near the end of the intro paragraph. And then, like I said, the process itself will mostly get explained and analyzed in your body paragraphs. And then in the conclusion, you need to repeat the thesis, but not word for word. You need to restate it, would be the better way of putting it. Restating it means Same ideas, but slightly different word choice, slightly different phrasing, just to show me that you can do that. Don't just cut and paste it from the intro. And then the final thing you need to do in that conclusion is sort of drive home the significance of this process. Why do people need to know it? Why is it important? How can it help us in our lives? And that might just take you a sentence or two, or it could take you a little longer depending on your process. So we'll talk about all of these individual paragraphs a little bit more next week when we start looking at our outline for Essay 2. But in the meantime, I have sort of a fun, informal activity that I wanted to encourage you guys to do. You do have a discussion post for this week, so there's a couple of pieces and 50 essays that we're going to read by pretty famous authors, Stephen King and Frederick Douglass. They're from very different time periods, but they're both famous. Read those. They're both kind of process analysis. I mean, not exactly. They're not following the exact same format that we are, but both King and Douglass are laying out complex processes. In the case of King, it's all about how to become a writer, how to write fiction like he does. In the case of Douglass, it's about learning how to read. Douglass teaches himself largely how to read while he's a slave in the 19th century. So two very different processes, but they are related. I mean, reading and writing. Two very different people, but they're both explaining processes. And I think if we're looking for some of the elements that we've been talking about, we'll see them. They both have structures, frameworks, and they're both breaking their processes down into individual steps, individual parts and elements. So read those. Those are good examples to keep in mind. But another thing I would like you to do later this week, if you get a chance and if you have somebody to perhaps do this with, you should try to do your own step-by-step instructions of a thing that most of us, can do and have done and probably did as kids, making a paper airplane. So this is kind of an easy way to practice some of our process analysis basics. This will basically just be step-by-step instructions, but it's okay. We can kind of start here and we'll get more sophisticated later. But see how easily you can do this. Just write step-by-step instructions or directions for the process of making a paper airplane. So this will be a directive process analysis. Pretty straightforward, but try to be as specific as possible. Break the process down into as many steps as you need. Be very specific and detailed every step along the way. So again, you can number these steps, would probably be easiest. You can use bullet points or letters, whatever you want. But once you've written the instructions, try to find a friend or a family member or a coworker or somebody that who you can give the instructions to, and then see if they are able to build a paper airplane based on your instructions. If they can, then your instructions were successful. If your friend is unable to make the airplane, or if the airplane does not fly, you got to test it. You got to give it a test flight to make sure that it works. If the plane does not fly, then maybe your instructions need to be improved a bit. So it's just kind of a fun way to see if we already kind of have a knack for doing this kind of work. Are we already sort of aware of how to provide instructions, how to provide information that will help our readers accomplish things? Often we think of reading as a passive thing. But not right now. With our process analysis, we are literally trying to enable our readers to do things, to accomplish things directly from reading our analysis. Either they're going to complete the steps themselves, or at the very least, they're going to understand how our process works. And that's still active. Understanding something is still an action. It's still an active thing. So let me know if you have any questions. I hope you can have some fun with the paper airplane, and we'll see each other next week as we get moving on Essay 2.